So I've got a returning guest in Ben. This time we're going to talk about something Ben and I come up with a title for that is a work in progress, which is boards versus boards. So Ben's going to talk, he's brought some stuff, some show and tell. Ben's going to talk about boards and what that means for the industry, some interesting stats. And I'm going to hand over to Ben to give him a little overview as to what the boards versus boards is, and then some screen sharing slides. So Ben, over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Lee. Well, the reason why I thought this would be useful and why your wonderful listeners would find some interest in this is because Agency Express, we work with a huge amount of estate agents around the country. And we gather a huge amount of data on what's going on with new properties coming to the market, sales moving through, sales completing, etc. And that data at the moment, we produce something called the Property Activity Index, which is a monthly release which we push out, which has about a reader viewership of 3. And the data itself is actually really interesting and tells us an awful lot about what's going on in the housing market. So I thought I would use this as a grandstanding platform to try and get people to actually look at some of my data. And then it might help them to understand what's coming, because the really cool thing about what we do with boards, we're right at the start of that transaction process.
Yes.
So whereas when we're looking at Halifax data or nationwide data or even Rightmove data and so on, it's always a little bit further down the road. We know that when the board goes up, it's right at the start of the process. It's right at the start of the listing. It's right at the start of the sale agreement. It's right at the start of the completion. So we're seeing things probably 3 months earlier than everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we see day to day. This is who we work with. So around 7,500 customers around the country, estate agents of different types, and that's everything from small independent guys, so 1 and 2 man bands, right up to big corporates, names that obviously your clients would either know or be part of. And they provide us with somewhere in the region of 1.2 million movement visits a month. Well, what's a movement? That's us visiting a property to do something. Now that may be putting a board up to market for sale. It may be changing this up to sold to show that the property is sold, or maybe bringing the board back in on completion, right? But 1.2 million visits as far north as Inverness, all the way down to the southern tip of Cornwall. The interesting thing, when you then draw that data out, that is somewhere in the region of 475,000 individual properties that we visit. So nearly 500,000 unique properties that we will visit at some point throughout the year, conducting one of these actions. And all of that data, all those customers, all those visits, all feed into the same place. They feed in through our SignMaster system, which is our internal management system, manages what our on-the-ground guys do, and it's what our estate agency customers use to make their requests. But each one of those transactions is logged, and then we can benchmark it against other things. But rather than get into the really awesome, dirty data in the middle today, I just thought we'd start with some of the headline stuff, because I suspect for most people that's the bit they're most interested in.
Thanks, Ben.
So what should we start with? Well, here's a very quick and simple line graph as to what's been happening this year in terms of new listings coming to the marketplace as to what happened last year. So the blue line that we've got there, which is going up and down through the year, is the number of new listings that we have received from the client base around the country each month. So the number of boards that have gone up to market property for sale. And then your orange line, which is sitting over the top, is your number of new listings from 2024. And as you probably noticed immediately, they're completely different. So what are we actually seeing in the marketplace then? What's changed? Well, the one that jumped out at me more than anything else was April. Mm-hmm. There's a huge spike, there's a huge gap there. And what I've actually done on the second slide is show you the number difference. So on this one, we can actually see the count number difference from one to the next. Now the blue line that we can see on there, the 2023 line, is fairly atypical. So if I go back through, I've been doing this nearly 20 years, and I look through the data, we'll see the actual number itself will change because the amount of transactions are up, but the actual line itself largely stays the same. We're all used to seeing the blip around Easter, which we can see there in sort of Feb-March data, and then the spike around sort of late spring, so May through to June, which we can see there. And then that kind of flattened plateau there for through the rest of the year. We're not seeing that this year. That hasn't happened. the spikes come in a much more stable and steady way. So we can see
Yes.
that isn't that natural peak through the Easter period, and then it's ramped up steadily. So rather than having that Easter spike and then drop off, which we can see at 32k to 28k properties, it's actually kept going up. And probably more interestingly for me was the peak of it has come earlier. So as you can see, we can see the peak of the transactions, the peak of the number of properties coming to the marketplace has happened in May rather than later on into June. So the first question you're probably going to ask me is, why?
It was on my lips, Ben. It was on my lips.
Yeah, I don't know. That's the short answer. There's no obvious trigger there. The second interesting thing that I think we were all expecting to see was a shift after sort of post-election. Yeah, so what has that done to the marketplace? And again, there's no immediate answer there, is there? You know, the numbers of properties coming on are actually looking really healthy and looking healthier than they were last year. Now, I think most people would agree that volumes in terms of property are better at the moment. So that's maybe not a massive surprise. But in terms of when they're coming on, it's different, isn't it? It's shifted. Something's changed. And we're seeing a different curve in that marketplace. And it's sitting higher than it was last year. So I think these 3 months that we can see here, through May through to July, show us something really interesting. Why was the peak last year around 35,000 properties in June? Why was it a little bit later? Is it weather related perhaps? I wouldn't have thought so. Pretty much rained the whole of last year, didn't it? So I don't think that makes a lot of difference.
Standard for us, standard.
It's raining today, so you know we'll compare it to today's figures. But then you look at this year's May through to July, it's not the same. So something's shifted. So what else can we see? So we can also track solds. So the number of properties that we're marking as sold, as with a sold slip or a sold board that the agent has indicated to us. Again, what we've got here is our 2023 sold curve, and then our 2024 sold curve. Now again, if I go to the numbers,
Ben, just for one thing for clarity. So that is sold as in when it's not completed, it's sold as in board's gone up. This is data from a board, not a completion, which is interesting because obviously you'll have drop off and other things that happen along the way, but this is specifically the boards.
That's right. So if we're adding a sold slip to a board, the property isn't sold. It's SSTC, as we all know.
Yes.
So it's subject to contract. It's under offer. But that's the trigger point that we can then monitor going forward. Now, when we go to retrieve the board, we can essentially count that in inverted commas as a completion. Yes. That's a much harder metric for us to measure. When we're looking at the actual sold slip going on the board, this is when the agent's indicated to us that the property is sold. Okay, so what we're seeing here is a much flatter line, a much more manageable curve.
It is.
Whereas in 2024, there was a lot more peaks and troughs. So we saw this huge upshift in March last year, which we did not see this year. And it's quite a sharp difference. You know, so from our perspective, 2,000 transaction difference, or 3,000 nearly, that's massive. Yet, then there was this massive drop off into April. So what happened there? You know, I don't have any easy answers here. There's going to be a lot of factors involved. All I can do is present the data as we find it, you know, and then we have to try and interpret it ourselves. But if we go back to the actual curve line of the graph, this one here I think is quite interesting. It again shows a similar trend to the new listings, to the for sale boards, in that we're seeing a much flatter curve. It's much more stable. We're not seeing this peaking and troughing as we were in 2004. So is that telling us that the market's settled? That we're finally going into what we would have considered a more normal marketplace, sort of pre-COVID, pre-pandemic? Or is it a case that things are cooling? Perhaps what this is telling us is, although the numbers are still good, excuse me, in terms of the overall numbers, we're not seeing that sort of rampant adjustment in people's appetite towards the property market. Maybe that's shifted.
I think it's more, to be honest with you, from my own personal opinion, I think it's more of an adjustment to the market and seeing the stability now of the adjustment. And I think maybe next year you may see a similar graph to all the other years that you've said.
Yeah,
but I definitely think this year there has been a lot of changes. There's been a lot of things that have happened over the last, couple of years. So to see the market adjust and become a bit more stable, I personally feel is a good thing for the market, because I feel like it hasn't known what to do. Whereas now I feel people's confidence is probably more stable, which is then good for obviously agents, property industry, and all the rest of it. So I'm really pleased to see that the market is a lot more stable and
Yes, certainly
producing.
seems to be. I think the interesting thing that we're going to see going forward here is, obviously we're not through the year yet, and I can only show you up until August, although when we're recording this, we're past that.
Mm,
You know, what we'll see over the next few months will be really interesting, because as we can see here, the graph is starting to align itself again. So you've got
yes.
this unusual sort of very much more flat transactional curve here. But then as we get to August, it's evened out again. Look, that's starting to stable out. And
Yes.
I have a suspicion, and I haven't seen the data yet for this month, but I actually think what we're going to see is that is going to drop out again, and we're going to fall more into this natural curve through to the end of the year. Although I think the transaction volumes will still be a little bit higher.
Yeah.
So the next
You never
next
guess what
graph,
me and you never
go
guess what
on.
me and you are doing later on in the year, Ben.
Are we talking again about it?
Then we're definitely going to.
Are we? Because I'm going to get some more granular data for you for next time, because I wanted to start at the top, right? The really big high level stuff. But I think what will be really interesting is if we can hotspot certain areas and certain regions and say, actually, I can drill that data down to Birmingham. What's going on
Mm.
there? How does that compare to the national average? What are we seeing there in comparison to
Yeah, it'd be
what we're
really
seeing in
wicked.
London or Scotland or Wales or wherever we want to look? We can break it down to that level. Obviously, the closer in you zoom, the more irregularity you're going to see in your data, because smaller shifts will make a bigger impact on the graph. But overall, you should be seeing similar shapes and trends, whereas actually we know from looking at this data previously, it doesn't always track that way. And it's always quite surprising to see the areas that pop out with all of a sudden they'll see a huge activity interest. A bit like what we had after COVID, it's fascinating for us to watch internally post-COVID with that whole, what did they call it? The Great Migration, they called it, didn't they? Where everyone moved out of the cities.
Mm.
We could literally see that in the data. You could see the number of transactions booming in regional, rural locations, places like the Lake District, Peak District, Yorkshire, and going off a cliff in London. And we could see that 3 months before everyone else, because the board data was telling us that before obviously the mortgage data would. So the last one I've got for you for today, because I'm conscious
Thanks,
that
Ben.
we never have too much time, is the for sale board curve versus the sold board curve. So in theory, these graphs, these lines, should
Yep.
trend in line with each other, bar a month or two behind. Because let's work out on the average property transaction, board goes up,
Yep.
property should sell within 3 months. In a normal marketplace, property should complete shortly after. And what we're seeing here is that initially they do seem to do that. We can see that earlier lower start point, it trends upwards. It then moves into this higher point here, and then it drops off here. The interesting thing that I noticed with this is actually shown much better on the second graph, which is this one. And what this does is it shows us the gap between those 2 points. The bigger the gap between those 2 points, in theory, the higher the peak was earlier on the graph. So for example, we can see that this sits quite neatly for quite a long time, and then we've got like this hole here in June. So what happened there? Why all of a sudden? Because it's not that we got a massive spike in listings, we didn't. That's leveled out. We've actually got a drop off in sales. So what created that? Again, we don't have the answers to why these things happen. Perhaps it'd be fascinating to hear from some of your listeners who, experience this on the ground. What is it that perhaps is a catalyst there that's created it? But it's something that must have happened across the whole of the country, because it's affected the numbers to that extent. It's quite a big shift. So it's seen a big dip downwards, which we haven't seen in the listing data. And then what we've seen is those between lines, those they have a proper name, these things, I can't remember what they're called, column lines in the graphs, then start to bleed closer together. Okay, so then those numbers close in. So something's happened there, hasn't it? Something has definitely happened in this section here, which has created a wider gap. Now, is it just that the volume of properties coming to the marketplace through that spring-summer period is enough that it's made a shift? Or is it actually that something has slowed down the sale transaction in that period? Could be a little bit of both. But it's always important to remember that we're seeing this earlier than anyone else. So when we're seeing this period of data here, so the May-June period, that's kind of what your listeners are going to be feeling now in the marketplace. Because if something has agreed sale in, let's say, June, July, it's probably going to be transacting in August, isn't it? So this here is really the space that they're going to be feeling now. But what I'm expecting to see, I suppose the last thing I can share with you, what am I expecting to see going forward? We're certainly going to see new listing transactions come down as we move towards the end of the year. We've definitely seen a flatter curve, which suggests the market is stabilizing, as we said. And we're definitely seeing that the number of boards up compared to the number of boards sold the gap is reducing. So in theory, that tells us that either stock is decreasing, so the number of new properties that are being released and coming to the marketplace is reducing, or the number of properties that are being sold is increasing, or of course both. So I don't have the answers as to why those things are happening. All we can do is just say what we can see. It's a bit like catchphrase.
No, I appreciate it, Ben. And Ben, I want to say, a massive thank you for bringing the numbers, the data. For me, I personally feel it's really exciting to see the numbers before the rest of the world sees numbers. And I am grateful that you've brought, the boards versus the boards. And I think that we should definitely do a catch up later on in the year, maybe another 3 months' time, to see how that data translates in 3 months. Maybe we could do these quarterly or something. I don't know. I'm making this stuff up, but I feel that it would be good for the audience. And I just want to say thank you very much, Ben. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. We're always happy to share the data, and there's so much out there that we don't see, in our industry, and that isn't shared. So anything where we can just turn a spotlight on something that might be useful for agents to start to see trends earlier, it's going to benefit everyone, isn't it?
It is. Ben, thank you so much, and I appreciate your time.
No worries at all. Cheers, Lee.